This channel is part of the History Hit Network. Stick around to find out more.
The White House in Washington, home of the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States. Every 4 years, there's a new decision who will move in here. American election campaigns have long been a model for the world's democracies, setting standards and seeing turning points.
Good evening.
From the first televised debate to a billion-dollar business. From home story to smear campaign. From canvassing to the internet, new methods were constantly developed in the presidential election campaigns of the USA. Time and again, there were surprises too. From Kennedy to Obama, every election campaign had its own history.
Senator John F. Kennedy.
Yes, we can.
Mr. President.
In 1960, the second term of President Eisenhower comes to an end. Wanted a successor. Two candidates are competing against each other, and both will go down in history. Richard M. Nixon, Republican Party, is already the vice president. John F. Kennedy, Democratic Party, is an unknown senator, but he has a rich father, and his siblings form a powerful election campaign organization.
Kennedy constituted change and Nixon constituted continuity, and in that election, Kennedy had a very young and very attractive wife in Jacqueline Kennedy, a young family, and it caught a spirit in the early 1960s that America was moving in a different direction or moving forward or going into a different period.
In 1960, when Kennedy competes against Nixon, around 90% of American households already have a television set. This new medium shapes the election campaigns. Politics enter the living room, and so do campaign commercials.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
and young enough to do.
Well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you.
The commercials should do one thing above all: hammering the name of the candidate into the viewers' heads.
Kennedy and his wife have a 2-year-old daughter, Caroline, and Mrs. Kennedy is currently expecting the birth of a second child.
Kennedy is the first candidate who has his family appear before the camera.
The Kennedy campaign created an ad featuring Jacqueline Kennedy with children on her lap in order to suggest that Kennedy wasn't too young and that what was young about him was positive, not negative.
Television revolutionized election campaigning. The debate between the two candidates, broadcast live, reaches 70 million viewers. Nothing like this had happened ever before in history.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy. According to rules set by
the age of television quite clearly began in 1960 with the first televised debates between Nixon and Kennedy.
We find that the prices you pay went up 5 times as much in the Truman administration as they did in the Eisenhower administration.
Nixon is doing well, But in front of the TV camera, it's not his prepared speech that turns out to be crucial, probably more to his own surprise than to anybody else's.
Both campaigns had worked aggressively to try to control the temperature. The last person who set the temperature was someone in the Kennedy campaign.
History Hit is a streaming platform that exclusively releases quality historical documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. From ancient Neolithic cultures to the dawn of the space race, History Hit has thousands of hours of content with unrivaled access to the world's best historians. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and Timeline fans can get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
Nixon had a perspiration problem. So under the hot lights of television, manipulated by the Kennedy campaign, which increased the temperature of the room, Nixon was sweating throughout the debate, playing into the stereotype that he was somehow guilty.
John F. Kennedy would never have been elected president if it hadn't been for that presidential debate, and if Nixon had just not perspired. I mean, that's how simplistic it gets.
Smith, Senator Kennedy, the things that Senator Kennedy has said, many of us can agree with.
Interestingly, people who listened to that debate on radio felt that Nixon did better than Kennedy. People who watched the debate on television believed that Kennedy did better. And I think it was the first moment when we really began to realize the power of television in presidential campaigns.
The candidate who comes over in personality terms as warm, friendly, or smart, or whatever, just in the body language, can affect the outcome of an election. And that is just the reality of life.
Washington has got a new president. The TV debate makes the winner. John F. Kennedy is the first president of the media age and one of the youngest presidents in American history.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy is assassinated after only 1,000 days. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in as the new president. He now wants to be elected by the people, and soon afterwards, the campaign begins. Johnson's rival candidate is Barry Goldwater, an extremely conservative Republican who even speaks about the possible use of nuclear weapons. Johnson is leading in the polls by a large margin throughout the election campaign. His campaign team discovers something new, how television can arouse emotions. For example, anxiety, as shown in the best known of all American election spots to this day.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Only Johnson's voice is heard.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
The famous Daisy ad from 1964, which Lyndon Johnson used to great effect, suggesting that Barry Goldwater, if elected, would resort to nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War. That was pretty dirty. I mean, it doesn't get much dirtier than that.
What's amazing about the ad is it never once mentions the name of Barry Goldwater. And the advertising genius behind the ad, Tony Schwartz, makes the point that advertising is effective, not because it seeks to convince voters of something, but because it seeks to remind them of things they already know.
Johnson succeeds. But at the end of his first elected term, he decides not to take up again, to everyone's surprise. His own party has urged him, because he has to answer for the war in Vietnam, which is extremely unpopular. Another surprise is the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, the man who ran in vain against the unknown Kennedy 8 years ago. His departure from politics already had seemed to be a done deal. Vice President Hubert Humphrey is the Democratic candidate. He started late in the race for the presidency. Fierce conflicts are raging between the wings of the party at the Democratic nominating convention in Chicago. Humphrey can barely prevail. And outside in the city, the protests of the Vietnam War opponents are escalating.
The violence in Chicago helped the Republicans. Richard Nixon campaigned as a law and order candidate. He also campaigned with the suggestion that he would find a way out of Vietnam, which it took him years to do, and many more protests that occurred during his presidency, as we know. But there was a sense of the country being out of control in 1968, and Nixon and the Republicans played on that theme.
Many young volunteers are helping with the campaign. In the United States, canvassing has always been important to get out the vote. But to set the masses in motion, the campaign teams become more and more professional.
1968 is the year where you really see the professional consultants flooding into presidential campaign politics.
There are people who are saying, I am a campaign consultant, who had specialized knowledge and used polling and focus groups in order to figure out what the audience wanted to hear, and then tailored messages using professional production techniques, and tested those messages to make sure that they accomplished the objective. That's what we mean when we say spin doctor.
Nixon's advisors ensure that he only appears in controllable situations, so no debate live on television is held against Humphrey. Public discussions are staged for Nixon instead, so-called town hall meetings.
Richard Nixon held a number of town hall meetings, and there would be a panel, a housewife, a plumber, a doctor, an African-American taxi driver, and we in the media kept looking for some manner in which the Nixon campaign had stacked the panel. In other words, were they trying to put Nixon's supporters on the panel? And we were never able to find that. And it was only after 2 or 3 of these events took place that we realized we were looking in the wrong place. What the Nixon campaign had done was to stack the audience. They brought in 400 or 500 avid Nixon supporters. The questions that the panelists asked were perfectly reasonable questions, sometimes even fairly tough questions. But the audience would respond so favorably to everything that Nixon said that it looked as though he was having a brilliant, brilliant performance.
Nixon's strategy is successful. He wins the election of 1968. After 8 years, the Republicans have won the White House again. In 1972, they want to defend it. There are new concerns. The economy is faltering, high inflation, rising unemployment, and Nixon's biggest problem, he has promised to end the Vietnam War, so far without success. At first, his approval ratings in the polls are decreasing.
In the '72 election, Nixon was able to use one of his strong suits. One of his strengths was that he had a pretty good understanding of geopolitics.
Shortly before the crucial campaign phase begins, Nixon is writing history. As the first statesman of the West, he meets Mao Zedong, the communist dictator. A welcome side effect, Nixon is the main media topic.
You don't bring 110 reporters and technicians with you because you're trying to keep this below the horizon. He brought us all along because he wanted this thing to be covered, and covered in great detail.
So-called man-in-the-street interviews are supposed to show Nixon's popularity.
I think the president is doing a fine job and has taken his job very seriously.
You better believe it. I am going to vote for President Nixon.
America needs President Nixon, and he needs you.
Hard work is required until such easy and spontaneous answers are recorded.
That we have now that we haven't had before.
Okay, I wonder if you could answer me that once again, but a little tighter, a little shorter. What do you think of President Nixon as a president? And start it again, since the president's been in power.
No, wait, no, that's not.
The president said he's going to bring home the troops from Vietnam.
Right.
All right, let me ask you that again, see if you can make it a little bit tighter. Want to do it once again?
How would you like me
shorter,
to say it?
Just shorter. Just try it again.
Show me again. Tell me.
No.
I don't know how to say it. How can you say it shorter?
All right, now do the same thing and look right at the camera when you do it.
You better believe it. I am going to vote for President Nixon.
Thanks very much. That's great.
The younger generation increasingly questions the values of the hardliner Nixon. This is the constituency of the Democratic contender, George McGovern.
McGovern was, in many ways, a surprise nominee. Nobody had thought at the beginning of that election that he would be the nominee. But the Democratic Party was in turmoil over Vietnam, and he was one of the strongest anti-war candidates in the field, and he was able to prevail.
I accept your nomination with a full and grateful heart.
McGovern's anti-military attitude is an easy target for Nixon's campaign.
He would cut the Marines by 1/3, the Air Force by 1/3. He'd cut Navy personnel by 1/4. He would cut interceptor planes by 1/2, the Navy fleet by 1/2, and carriers from 16 to 6. President Nixon doesn't believe we should play games with our national security. He believes in a strong America, to negotiate for peace from strength.
Nixon's popularity is rising again. His strategy seems to work.
Richard Nixon and his people committed the most horrific act of self-damage that I can think of in American politics. Nixon was going to win that election regardless, and he was probably going to win by a large margin.
But then, something unforeseen happens. A break-in in the campaign headquarters of the Democrats in the Watergate building. The motives are initially unclear. One thing is certain. The Republican campaigners resort to criminal means.
Why did it happen? Partly because of Nixon's insecurity. Partly when I became aware of the extent of it, which was very late in the game, I called an old associate of Nixon's who had been advisor to Eisenhower and said, how could this happen? And he said some fool went into the Oval Office and did what he was told.
Washington Post journalists are thoroughly investigating who is behind it and on what scale they played the dirty tricks.
A whole constellation of activities, some of them technically legal, but really unconstitutional in principle, some of them illegal, that had to do with using the national security authority of the president and the Secretary of State and the national security advisor to the president for purposes that it was not intended.
In the wake of Watergate, campaign contributions are on the political agenda. There's talk about $25 million for Nixon. All begins with an unfortunate accident.
When these guys were arrested inside Democratic Party headquarters,
They all had lots of $100 bills in their pockets, all sequentially numbered. And it wasn't hard for the FBI to trace this back to a campaign fund that hadn't been reported, legally reported. And campaign finance simply became a part of a bigger scandal that started out simply as what you might call political dirty tricks. The key issue was that there were things going on, the corporate contributions and the really big individual contributions from rich donors were going on, and were going on in secret.
Nixon's campaign advertising unaffectedly shows an ideal world. Eventually, he is re-elected with more than 60% of the vote. But soon after, suspicion arises that he is behind the Watergate machinations. Nixon denies everything.
The American public was very trusting of presidents. So when Nixon stands up and says, it didn't happen, I'm not involved, understand that I am the president of the United States, I'm going to China and Russia, the public is actually disposed to believe him. If the same thing happened today, the public would be disposed to believe that there's nothing good the person has done, and the person was an accomplice in anything that one might have suggested.
The whole world found out the evilness of the evil that had affected the administration and the White House and the operation of the White House and of the presidency of Richard Nixon. And
the president himself.
And the president himself, absolutely right.
We had never had a criminal president before who undermined the Constitution of the United States in the way that Nixon had.
At the acme of his power, of his achievement, when he had settled Vietnam, opened relations to China, created better relations with Russia, established confidence in Europe, at that precise moment, he lost everything through his own foolishness. And he knew it was through his own foolishness.
Nixon has to resign. The vice president who succeeds him was not elected by the people, Gerald Ford. His predecessor as vice president had resigned due to allegations of corruption. Gerald Ford now follows into the Oval Office, and only 2 years later, he will have to compete in his own election campaign.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
A largely unknown man, the governor of Georgia runs for the Democrats.
That kind of a man, in the wake of Watergate, seemed like a breath of fresh air.
There was a major headline on the editorial page of the Atlanta Constitution that said Jimmy Carter is running for what? And the what was about this today. I'm running for president.
We are now in an entirely different political world in which the farmer from Georgia seems like a refreshing alternative to those in Washington who are cast as those who engage in artifice and deception, those who promise and don't deliver, and those who do indeed lie.
One of the big talking points of Jimmy Carter was, I won't lie to you. Now, you would think that most presidential candidates wouldn't have to say that.
He comes wearing jeans or simple sweaters, presenting himself really as sort of the opposite of, an elite, regal Washington politician.
Carter is self-deprecating enough to play around with his peanut farmer image. The plane for his campaign trips is called Peanut One, an allusion to Air Force One, the president's plane. And he carries his bags himself, a pointed gesture. The candidates get the opportunity to confront the opponent and the voters in a TV debate for the first time since 1960. Ever since then, there hadn't been any TV debates at all.
Because the candidates were afraid of them, because they saw what had happened with Kennedy-Nixon. And so, and that could happen to anybody. Kennedy-Nixon was not seen as something, oh, well, now we're going to have presidential debates in our country. And the pressure to do that came primarily from network.
Health care that is affordable. These things can be done.
I'd say, first of all, that I think in case of the Carter administration, the sacrifices would be much less.
Carter wins the election narrowly, but he wins it. The mood for change after the Nixon debacle is ultimately decisive.
Good evening. I'm here tonight to announce my intention to seek the Republican nomination for President of the United States.
Former actor Ronald Reagan became famous as a Western hero. He'd been head of the Screen Actors Guild and thus entered politics. For 10 years, he was the governor of California, the largest state of the U.S.
Ronald Reagan could both talk one-on-one and talk to a camera. And when he did, you had the sense that he was engaging you as an individual. That's a capacity he may have had naturally, but it was certainly honed during his experience as an actor.
Carter tried to win his second run with the same means as the first: authenticity, humility, honesty. But Carter's method is no longer alluring. In Iran, radical Islamists have taken power. In Tehran, they take 52 American diplomats hostage.
Then people like me began ticking off the days. America held hostage day 23, day 40, day 70, day 95. And with each passing day, it became more of a death toll for the Carter administration.
Reagan promises, with him in charge, a strong America will restore world peace. This is balm for the American soul. But above all, he wants to convey good feelings. Once again, two candidates oppose each other for a TV debate. The Democrat Jimmy Carter should have an advantage. He is the incumbent president, and he is 13 years younger than his Republican rival Reagan.
He was very engaging. He was handsome. He also was not stupid. He had previously been governor of California, so he didn't move directly from Hollywood studios into the White House. And he was able to actually perform really well, especially in the TV debates, with a kind of charm and wit and humor, which he possessed, but which Jimmy Carter completely lacked.
This attitude is extremely dangerous and belligerent in its tone, although it's said with a quiet voice.
Governor Reagan, I know the president is supposed to be replying to me, but sometimes I have a hard time in connecting what he's saying with what I have said or what my positions are. I sometimes think it's like the witch doctor that gets mad when a good doctor comes along with a cure that'll work.
By standing on the stage with Carter and not sounding scary or saying anything reckless, Reagan provided reassurance.
The candidates are not permitted to...
One of the reasons for Reagan's successful performance in the debate, he has practiced for the situation more thoroughly than Carter.
The briefing has to set up a confrontation atmosphere that the candidate is preparing himself for. So they get a feel for what it means to be challenged. Because this doesn't happen in their life very often. And suddenly you've got three reporters in front of you you don't even know, and they're saying, well, that doesn't seem too bright to me, Mr. President, or your opposition says you don't know how to walk and chew gum at the same time. What do you think of that? So you need to kind of get them in the mind frame for a debate.
This is being filmed, analyzed, and they would retreat, even though the calendar is full, of course. They really invested a lot of time because everyone knows if this fails, one wrong moment, one wrong answer, then the whole campaign could go down the drain.
Carter repeatedly brings his family into play. He even allows cameras and microphones in the private rooms of the White House. An old campaign strategy is driven further, personality and closeness instead of politics.
I had a discussion with my daughter Amy the other day before I came here to ask her what the most important issue was. She said she thought nuclear weaponry.
It did seem odd to have a president of the United States reference very problematic, fraught policy area and seemed to be taking discussions with his daughter about it seriously.
Of course, he didn't mean that. It was an awkward phrase of his, but the fact that he mentioned his daughter at all in connection with policy probably hurt his performance a little bit.
Reagan wins a landslide victory. Carter is the first president who is elected out of office in nearly 50 years. But outsider Reagan had the better promise. America is coming back to its former strength. And the vice of the new president is called George Bush.
Good evening. On behalf of the Commission on Presidential Debates, I am pleased to welcome you to this first presidential debate of the 1988 campaign. I'm Jim Lara of the MacNeil-Lara NewsHour. The candidates are Vice President George Bush, the Republican nominee, Governor Michael Dukakis, the Democratic nominee.
George H.W. Bush, much taller than Michael Dukakis. Well, Dukakis' people negotiated a little riser that Dukakis could stand on that wouldn't make it completely equal, but the disparity in height would not be as obvious as it would have been otherwise.
Neither one of them was a gifted candidate. But the Bush campaign had a better team working for them.
Initially, George Bush relied on feel-good advertising as if it were a diaper brand. He builds up an image as a benevolent father figure. Michael Dukakis, the Democratic Party candidate, is governor of Massachusetts. He's considered quite successful.
Dukakis was a sound fellow, a sort of competent fellow, but not very dynamic, and he did not project much of a vision. Neither did George Bush.
Dukakis was ahead in the polls until the Bush campaign began airing ads.
As a candidate, Michael Dukakis called Boston Harbor an open sewer. As governor, he had the opportunity to do something about it, but chose not to. The Environmental Protection Agency called his lack of action the most expensive public policy mistake in the history of New England. Now, Boston Harbor, the dirtiest harbor in America, will cost residents $6 billion to clean.
As it turns out, some scenes for this TV commercial were filmed somewhere else. The forgery is soon apparent. But Dukakis doesn't strike back immediately. His response is differentiated and too slow. Thus it has no effect.
It is the first year in which we have conclusive evidence that advertising moves votes when the other side doesn't respond at the same level to the ads. The Dukakis campaign didn't believe these ads could possibly work. And by the time they realized that they were, it was too late to counteract them.
And I was asking Dukakis how it was that he wasn't more active and trying more things to close the gap. And he kept saying, well, there's still plenty of time. There's still plenty of time. And I said, Governor, you just don't get it. It was a very impolite thing of me to say, and I regretted having said it afterwards. But instead of coming down and saying, Mr. Koppel, you're the one who doesn't get it, if he had been tough with me, he might even have won a few more votes, but instead it was rather lame. There was no fight there. And I think the American public sensed that.
The crime issue was especially tough. The crime rate was still quite high by the late 1980s. It was a big problem in a lot of American cities. People no longer felt they could walk the streets at night.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
And the accusation against Mike Dukakis was that he had aided and abetted this activity. So some of the techniques that were used on that campaign were definitely some pretty mean ones, and they were ones that have set the stage for some use thereafter also.
Despite the aggressive commercials, there is no scandal during the TV debate. Bush already sees himself as the winner, but Dukakis is also convinced that he himself is right.
And the best America is not behind us. The best America is yet to come.
My fellow Americans, I am that man, and I ask for your support. Thank you very much.
George Bush wins the election. But with just over 50%, the turnout is the lowest in over 60 years. Political disenchantment is rising. George Bush, the incumbent president, has enormous approval ratings 1 year before the election. Yet,
the public's focus had shifted from foreign policy, where they had given Bush good marks, to domestic policy and to an economy that was now sputtering. And Bush, as a kind of well-to-do, elite New England Republican, he didn't seem to have a feeling for what ordinary people were going through in the recession.
His opponent, Bill Clinton, governor of insignificant state Arkansas. At 46, he's one of the youngest presidential candidates in history, almost as young as John F. Kennedy.
Bill Clinton, who came from a humble background, who was coming out of Arkansas, a state that had a lot of troubles when he took over as governor there, Clinton seemed to get it. Clinton seemed to understand people's economic distress.
The 1992 election is decided on the economy. The campaign strategists for Bill Clinton had a sign on their wall saying, "It's the economy, stupid."
I think the "It's the economy, stupid" tagline did help kind of focus everybody in terms of what we were trying to speak about, and it's always very helpful to have something that very simply summarizes the overall goal. "It's the economy, stupid" kind of nicely cuts through it, and it's just a way to sort of focus the mind for many people.
Clinton's campaign team is applying the latest methods, but the work is extremely tiring.
I must have worked easily 6.5 days out of 7 every week for about a year that I worked on that campaign. I've never worked as hard on that in my entire life as I have on political campaigns. The commitment is complete.
Clinton's team set up what they called rapid response. And in some ways, this was a lesson learned from Dukakis' failure, that when you get attacked, you need to hit back right away.
Other techniques were new as well back then, albeit much slower.
They distributed VHS cassettes, which was still fairly innovative back then. They put the program on audio cassettes. Today we would call it audiobooks, which was relatively new, too. So at that time, they really used new channels. But today, it all seems a bit dusty.
I was born in a little town called Hope, Arkansas, 3 months after my father died. It was a wonderful little small town where, it seemed that everybody knew everybody else.
Some people think that Bill must have been born wealthy and raised wealthy, that he had all of the privileges that you could ever imagine. Well, instead of being born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he was really born into a house that had an outhouse in the backyard.
Talk shows are becoming more popular. Besides the usual TV debates, there is a new format now in which ordinary citizens are allowed to interview the candidates. This year, there are three: Ross Perot, George Bush, and Bill Clinton. A really incidental moment becomes an issue that everyone will remember.
George Bush looking at his watch. It was almost as though, I mean, you could interpret it one of several ways. I'm getting a little bored with this, or how much longer do I have to keep up this facade before this damn thing is over?
He hated debates. He said to me, if I had my way, there would be no presidential debates, because it's all about showbiz. It's all about these things. You know, about a guy looked at his watch. Oh, he did that. You know, that's not how you should decide who's going to be president of the United States.
Bill Clinton plays the saxophone. Music is a way to reach young people. However, for this, he needs to appear in shows that are usually shunned by politicians.
Clinton appeared in cooking shows and who knows where else. The main thing was that people could see him. From then on, which was pretty much from '92, this became a principle in all campaigns.
Clinton's family life plays a special part in this campaign, for there are problems.
In the run-up to the '92 campaign, Clinton's reputation from Arkansas as a womanizer was well known, and it was talked about.
So when these accusations were brought to light, you know, in December of '91, in January of 1992, there was certainly no shortage of us thinking, okay, well, you know, I'm going to be out of a job, you know, pretty soon, and feeling pretty low about that.
Hillary Clinton performed valiantly in a famous interview on the program 60 Minutes, and basically said, he's my guy, and he's reformed, and we're fine, our marriage is fine.
She was very supportive of her husband. She faced it all. I don't know. I wouldn't like to have been in his shoes in the evening at home. But for the public, it looked very good.
People like to see a man who is enduring some of the worst moments of his life. And he picks himself up, and he dusts himself off, and he puts a smile on his face, and he goes back to work. You have to admire that. And the American public did.
President Bush's election campaign is falling behind. Another president of the United States is in danger of being elected out of office.
One of his aides said, we were tired. The advisors were tired. The president was tired. We ran a rather tired campaign.
I always move that down the list because I'm a part of the problem. But that's true. After 12 years, people do get tired of a political regime and want to see a little change.
The underdog, Bill Clinton, with Hillary at his side, becomes the winner of the election of 1992 through a perfectly orchestrated campaign. His recipe: one campaign, one topic, the economy, stupid. While the political Washington is marked for a presidential Democrat again, rumors arise about continuing women's stories of the smart Southerner Clinton. But then, the Republicans, Clinton's opponents, use a new weapon. A special prosecutor investigates Clinton's affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. In 1998, the Republicans even try to impeach Clinton. This is already the prelude to the next election campaign.
Let's win this election for the American future. God bless you. Thank you.
Al Gore, vice president under Clinton. Without this backstory, his campaign might have turned out very different. Because politically and economically, the last 8 years have been a success. George W. Bush, governor of Texas and son of the former president, a rich man, is the Republican candidate.
Al Gore is notoriously stiff, so they tried to humanize him. And when you try to humanize someone who is notoriously stiff, it just looks like a notoriously stiff person trying to act more human. It didn't work very well.
It was actually very unlikely to lose against him, and that can only be explained by faults of the Gore campaign, and of course, strengths in the Bush campaign.
Al Gore leads in the polls, but he does not want to be associated with Clinton's affairs. That slows him down. Bush, on the other hand, proves to be a master in collecting donations.
At one point, I said to him, "Tell me, what do you think it is that qualifies you to be President of the United States?" And he said, "Well," he said, I'm the governor of a very large state." He said, "I've been a businessman, a part owner in a baseball team." He mentioned a couple of other relatively trivial things, and I said, "Forgive me, Governor, but those are great qualifications for president of the Kiwanis Club, but we're talking about of the United States." And he gave me a very clever answer. He said, "Look, I don't have to be the most qualified person in the country. I only have to be the most qualified person running for president."
Al Gore is mainly counting on the subject of environmental policy, but he underestimates his opponent. George W. Bush, on the other hand, does not try to appear in public as another person than he really is, which lends him credibility in the closest election race of all time.
He lost the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College, but he won the Electoral College only after 36 days of bitter fighting over the outcome of the result in Florida and a recount in a series of court cases that went all the way to our Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court called off the recounts and in essence handed the presidency to George W. Bush.
Although at least $250 million flow into the Bush campaign, in the end, only 537 votes are decisive. A young politician from Illinois, even without an office on the national level, steps up for the Democrats, Barack Obama. As it has been common since Kennedy, his wife and children are always present.
Our journey may be long, our work will be great, but we know in our hearts we are ready for change. We are ready to come together, and in this election, we are ready to believe again. Thank you.
Some listeners are reminded of the African American church by Obama's cadences during the election campaign. The Republican contender John McCain from Arizona, senator like Obama, but already in office for more than 20 years. Neither candidate has previously gained experience as president or vice president. The dispute is mainly about McCain's running mate, Sarah Palin, because she, as governor of Alaska, is accused of abuse of office and wastage.
McCain was an older candidate who had been injured as a result of torture and a plane crash while he was serving as a pilot in Vietnam. And so McCain walks somewhat awkwardly and doesn't have complete use of one of his arms. What the Obama campaign did to stress his age was slowed the visuals down to make him look as if he was not really competent.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. A slogan that puts his mark on the whole election campaign.
We are in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression.
You know, the stock market had crashed. We were sitting on the edge of another Great Depression. And into that steps a candidate who is assuring the country that it is great, that it has the capacity to overcome, that we are going to get past this terribly traumatic moment. It's a message the country needed to hear.
Obama gathers enthusiastic young helpers together who are able to master the latest media technology. Through data analytics and data mining, they collect as much information on potential voters as they can.
Even before the internet, they had started to knock on doors, of course. They said, man, there lives Grandma Barkley. who has always supported us. She is perhaps a bit unsteady on her feet. Come on. We knock and we ask if we can drive her to the polling station. With the data that they have today, they don't just knock on the door. They even know who's behind it, how they voted previously. They might know the children's names, where they study, and they might even know the dog's name. And then you actually start a conversation differently. You say, well, how's Tom? How's he doing at school? And so you have a much better opening for such a conversation than without data mining.
Obama's website is the centerpiece of his campaign. If you opt out of public campaign funding, your expenditures are not limited by law. Obama uses this. The key to his success is the button at the top right. Donate now. Obama collects more than $650 million, including $500 million from the internet, and most of it in small amounts. McCain, in contrast, collects a total of just over $200 million.
Does money matter? Yes. If both sides are comparable in the quality of their messaging, the candidate with more money will win.
In addition to traditional advertising, Obama's money is used especially for targeting small groups of voters. So Obama makes his way into the White House. He makes use of all possibilities of his era. But the basic problem of privately financed election campaigns remains.
You simply inevitably have a highly disproportionate share of the money coming from a very thin stratum of very rich people. And that's not democratic.
A presidential campaign in this country today is a billion-dollar operation that starts from nothing. It starts from scratch, and in a matter of 18 months to 2 years has become a billion-dollar corporation.
Well, I think that excess money, no matter what campaign it is or who's involved, is not good. And everybody is going to try to cheat.
Have we moved into a more enlightened age of campaigning? I don't think so, no.
The methods have changed. The goal remains. Many candidates compete, but in the end, only one moves into the White House. The last two remaining in the race fight with the gloves off. Voters are wooed and influenced, they are pried, and sometimes manipulated. These campaign methods are copied all over the world. The effort that the campaigners make has increased immensely, but the result isn't really predictable. No one is safe from surprises, because in the end, only the voters decide.